Hi there, my name is Megan Rowan, and this is my project on addressing tribal and social responsibility. The overarching message of all of this is corporate accountability and Indigenous rights. What exactly makes this social issue so important? For far too long, large-scale infrastructure projects have been developed without considering the full impact on Indigenous communities and marginalized populations. Companies often push forward with constructions without proper consultations, ignoring cultural significance and environmental risks and the rights of those most affected. This lack of accountability has led to land disputes, environmental destruction, and violations of Indigenous sovereignty, all of which stands in the way of meaningful social change. The core issue here is corporate responsibility. When corporations fail to engage Indigenous nations and impacted communities transparently, they've created conflict instead of collaboration. Many of these projects have resulted in legal battles, public protests, and long-term damage to both communities and corporate reputations. The failure to obtain free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous groups means that decisions are being made about their land and their resources without any of their input. This must change. Infrastructure development should not come at the cost of human rights, environmental sustainability, and/or cultural preservation. There is a clear need for corporations to embrace social change by adopting ethical business practices that include meaningful engagement, legal compliance, and long-term commitments to the communities that they impact. True social change happens when corporations take meaningful responsibility, engage with marginalized communities, and commit to ethical decision-making. At this point, it's time for corporations to change and rethink how they operate. We want sustainable, ethical developments, and we must demand corporate accountability that drives real, lasting social change. For this next section, we will be looking at visuals and statistical information from different locations, tribal communities, and experiences that we will see have a similar issue. This specific infographic highlights the massive land disposition Indigenous communities in the U.S. have faced over time, losing 97.7% of their land between 1776 and today. The shift from native-held land to reservations has led to lasting economic and legal struggles, with many tribes fighting for recognition and self-governance. It also addresses an ongoing corporate and governmental threat to native land. This directly connects to corporate responsibility, showing the failure to engage with Indigenous stakeholders leads to legal, reputational, and social resistance, a key issue for infrastructure planning. Now, this infographic, presented by UNESCO and UNDP, depicts how land degeneration disproportionately affects Indigenous communities. It illustrates how environmental destruction leads to loss of sacred sites, erosion of cultural identity, and negative mental health impacts. The tree metaphor perfectly and effectively shows the interconnectedness of land, food security, and Indigenous traditions, emphasizing how displacement and loss of customary governance increases social vulnerability. This visual makes it very clear to see that destruction of Indigenous lands has far-reaching consequences beyond the environment. It deeply impacts cultural survival and economic stability. This last infographic provides an overview of Indigenous populations worldwide, showing that they make up just 6% of global population, but are disproportionately affected by globalization and land disputes. It is a perfect example of highlighting the lack of representation in corporate and governmental decision-making, which has fueled conflicts over land rights. Indigenous knowledge and cultural traditions, which have been passed through generations, are at risk when corporations and governments ignore stakeholder engagement. This reinforces the importance of consulting Indigenous leaders early in infrastructure projects to prevent disputes and promote ethical business practices. Before diving any deeper into my next example cases, I want to take a moment to address why environmental factors must be a part of any discussion on social injustice. Too often, environmental issues are treated as separate from social struggles, when in reality, they are deeply connected. In a little bit, I'm going to be highlighting the Flint water crisis a little bit more, but right now, I want to talk about how this wasn't just a failure of infrastructure. It was environmental racism. The government's decision to switch to contaminated water source disproportionately affected low-income and Black communities, showing how environmental harm is often inflicted on those with the least political power. The reality is, social injustice and environmental harm often go hand in hand. Marginalized communities are the first to suffer from pollution, climate change, and corporate negligence. Ignoring the environmental component of these cases would mean ignoring a critical part of why these injustices happen in the first place. Now, moving on to my case study, the North Dakota Access Pipeline. As we move forward to plan the development of the Dakota Access Pipeline, we must ensure that we have corporate responsibility, social justice, and Indigenous rights that are prioritized from the very beginning. Large-scale infrastructure projects like this require extensive stakeholder engagement to prevent conflicts and ensure long-term success. The Dakota Access Pipeline has the potential to either be a model for ethical corporate decision-making or a case study in failure. The way that we handle this project will determine whether it respects Indigenous sovereignty and community concerns or repeats the mistakes of the past. Our goal at the end of the day is to balance economic viability with ethical engagement, and that means learning from previous cases of social injustice. By doing so, we can develop strategies that promote equity, transparency, and responsible corporate leadership. The company Energy Transfer Partners is currently in the planning stages of this project, which will directly impact the Standing Rocks tribe, Indigenous communities, and advocacy groups in North Dakota. If we were to move forward responsibly, we would take a proactive approach that prioritizes Indigenous groups, ethical corporate engagement, and long-term sustainability. A key priority in Indigenous consultation is ensuring that tribal leaders are not just informed, but actively involved and included in decision-making. This means respecting land rights, cultural preservation, and obtaining full consent from affected communities. Corporate responsibility must go beyond financial interests. It requires building trust, maintaining transparency, and addressing the concerns of those that are going to be most impacted. In addition to this, navigating government and legal challenges will require strict compliance with Indigenous right laws and regulatory framework to prevent disputes and delays. By addressing all of these concerns before construction even begins, we can avoid past mistakes, reduce resistance, and set a new standard for ethical infrastructure development that fully respects Indigenous sovereignty. And the opportunity is right in front of us. It's time to lead with responsibility and accountability. The Flint water crisis is a prime example of government and corporate negligence leading to environmental and public health disasters. In 2014, Flint, Michigan, switched its water source to Flint River to save costs. However, the water was not properly treated, leading to lead contamination that those exposed thousands of residents to severe health concerns. Low-income and minority communities were disproportionately affected by this. The government officials ignored public concern for years before taking action. The key takeaway here is that transparency and accountability are essential. Had the government prioritized public health over financial savings, this crisis could have been completely avoided. This case demonstrates a long-term consequence of failing to uphold ethical and responsible governance in large-scale infrastructure projects. The Coastal GasLink pipeline conflict is also a key example of corporate failure to respect Indigenous sovereignty. TC Energy planned a natural gas pipeline across British Columbia, running through unceded Wet'suwet'en land, without fully getting community consent. While elected band councils approved the project, the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who hold traditional governance over the land firmly opposed it. Rather than seeking full Indigenous approval, TC Energy moved forward with legal loopholes by bypassing traditional leadership. This led to a widespread protest with Indigenous land defenders blocking construction sites in an effort to protect their land and sovereignty. In a response, the Canadian government deployed militarized police to forcibly then remove the protesters, arresting land defenders and escalating tensions. The conflict sparked nationwide protests across all of Canada, bringing attention to the border issue of Indigenous rights in corporate development. This case highlights the dangers of corporate and government decisions, once again, when we ignore full Indigenous consultations, as well as then the long-term consequences of prioritizing legal technicalities over ethical engagement. Moving forward, large-scale infrastructure projects, and I can't say it enough, must prioritize meaningful long-term dialogue with Indigenous communities to ensure their sovereignty is fully recognized and then respected. The Bears Ears National Monument controversy is a clear example of how ignoring Indigenous rights in favor of corporate interests will always continue to lead to conflict. In 2016, Bears Ears was designated a national monument to protect sacred Indigenous lands, but just a year later, the U.S. government reduced its size by 85%, opening it to oil, gas, and mining development. This decision clearly disregarded Indigenous sovereignty. Despite strong opposition from all of the Native nations and tribal communities, even the tribal leaders were excluded from key discussions, and the rollback prioritized corporate resource extraction over cultural and environment preservation. The response, could you guess? Legal battles, public restraints, reputational damage for both the government and the corporations involved. The key lesson here is that, again, Indigenous land protections must be legally enforced to prevent exploitation. When governments and corporations ignore Indigenous consultations, they invite lawsuits, protests, and insustainability. Sustainability development must balance economic interests with cultural preservation. Otherwise, history will just continue to repeat itself again and again and again. If you can't tell by now, when we compare these cases, we see a very clear pattern. A lack of consultation, transparency, and ethical decision-making leads to major legal, political, and social consequences. The Flint water crisis, the Bears Ears Monument, and the Coastal GasLink pipeline are all prime examples of something that shows the dangers regarding marginalized communities. The key lesson here are that Indigenous rights and community engagement must be at the forefront of corporate planning. Public trust is crucial. The legal risks increase when companies fail to address social concerns. Ultimately, ethical and sustainable business practices are not just good for communities, but they also then contribute to long-term corporate success. This over here is my business model comparison table. At the end of the day, corporate decision-making is no longer about financial gain alone. It requires a strategy that includes the perspectives of all groups affected by the project. Several business models, some in this table even, help guide ethical decision-making, but they vary in effectiveness. To prevent the mistakes that we've already seen, like Flint, Coastal GasLink, and Bears Ears Monument, we must take a stakeholder engagement approach. In the Dakota Access Pipeline, this is going to be the most effective way to handle corporate disputes, reduce public resistance, and long-term trust. Too often, corporations operate in isolation, making decisions behind closed doors and informing communities only after plans are then finalized. This approach has repeatedly failed, leading to protests, lawsuits, and reputational damage. The stakeholder engagement model reverses this process by ensuring that these that are most affected, like the Indigenous nations, advocacy groups, and local communities, are active participants from the beginning. This model starts with early and inclusive consultations. Free, prior, and informed consent is essential. Indigenous communities must have a say before any development begins, not just as a legal formality, but as a core part of the decision-making process. Next, we establish a co-management agreement, where Indigenous leaders and local representatives oversee key aspects of the project. This isn't just about listening, It's about giving decision-making power to communities impacted. The transparency is another key pillar. Open communication, public reforms, and detailed project reports ensure communities stay informed and involved. Instead of waiting for conflicts to arise, we must create structured mediation and conflict resolution processes to address concerns early and constructively. And finally, corporate responsibility doesn't end when construction is complete. Long-term partnerships, community benefit agreements, and continued investment in local infrastructure ensure that the project leaves a positive, lasting impact. The stakeholders engagement model is the only way to ensure corporate responsibility is not just a box checked off, but a core principle guiding the new and improved, hopefully, plan of the Dakota Access Pipeline. It builds trust, prevents resistance, and ensures that Indigenous rights are respected, not just in words, but most importantly in action. Our project begins with the recognition that the past infrastructure developments have often failed to adequately address Indigenous rights, community concerns, and all of the things in between. Leadership at Energy Transfer Partners then need to acknowledge that a new approach is needed, one rooted in equity, transparency, and sustainable development. To prevent repeating past failures, we conduct an in-depth analysis of social justice conflicts related in infrastructure projects. By evaluating cases like the Flint water crisis, GasLink, and Bear Ear, we can then identify critical points of failure and where success needs to be so that we can inform and change our strategy. Using the insights from our case comparisons, we selected proven social responsibility frameworks to guide our approach. We will integrate the triple bottom line model, which balances economic, social, and environmental concerns, along with the stakeholder engagement models to ensure Indigenous and worker representation in project designs. In terms of our presentation to senior management, our proposal was formally presented to Energy Transfer Partners senior leadership. This included a comprehensive plan outlining the financial, ethical, and reputational benefits of a socially responsible pipeline approach. Supportive from leadership ensures that these measures will be adopted and executed at every level. For step 5, consultation with Indigenous communities is not going to be an afterthought. It's an essential part of our planning. We establish structured dialogue sessions, ensuring tribal leaders and community representatives have decision-making power in land use, environmental protections, and cultural site preservation. Moving on to step 6, we are going to go beyond Indigenous engagement. We are then going to slightly touch on labor practices, which must also be fair and equitable. We introduce higher wage standards, improve worker safety protocols, and a priority hiring system for local and Indigenous workers to promote economic benefits within affected communities. Step 7 is going to bring us into launching community engagement and advocacy programs. To maintain public trust, we launch ongoing community outreach programs, including informational town halls, social impact assets, and partnership opportunities with local businesses and advocacy groups. Transparency and two-way communication ensures community concerns are going to be addressed proactively. Step 8 is going to be touching on cultural sensitivity training for employees and contractors. All employees and contractors working on the project will undergo comprehensive training on Indigenous history, cultural awareness, and ethical engagement strategies. This ensures that the workers on the very grounds respect the values and traditions of the impacted communities. Now we're going to move on to implementing social impact assets. We established a framework for assessing and mitigating the project's social impact. Regular audits will be conducted to evaluate progress on labor rights, community feedback, and Indigenous consultation effectiveness. Adjustments will be made based on these assessments. Step 10, we are going to prevent disputes from escalating into protests or legal battles. We establish early a formal conflict resolution and mediation system. This will include a neutral third-party mediator, direct tribal representation, and an additional person to address grievances efficiently. Step 11 is going to be transparency. It's key to maintaining public and stakeholder trust. We implement quarterly reports detailing compliance with Indigenous consultation agreements, labor practices, social injustice initiatives, and these reports will be publicly accessible and subject to independent verification. For our final step, we need to remember this approach is not just about one project. It's about setting a precedent for future infrastructure developments. Energy Transfer Partners will commit to making Indigenous consultation, fair labor, and corporate accountability a permanent part of its business operations, ensuring that social justice is embedded in every future endeavor. Based on this timeline, by the end of year 5, the Dakota Access Pipeline project should be fully developed under an ethical, social, responsible framework. The long-term commitments that we talked about in step 12 will ensure continued accountability even beyond this timeline. The way corporations approach infrastructure development must change. For far too long, projects have moved forward without proper consultation, without transparency, and without respect for Indigenous sovereignty. This failure to engage affected communities had led to conflict, continuous legal battles, and honestly, irreversible harm. If we truly want to drive social change, corporate responsibility cannot be an afterthought. It must be the foundation of every decision. By prioritizing stakeholder agreement, free, prior, and informed consent, and long-term accountability, corporations can shift from conflict-driven models to collaboration-based solutions. This isn't just about ethical business practices. It's about ensuring that communities have a voice in the projects that impact them the most. If we continue to ignore these issues, we will see history continue to repeat itself. More disputes, more resistance, and more broken trust. But if we choose a different path, one built on transparency, equity, equality, and respect, we can set a new precedent for ethical infrastructure development that benefits both corporations and communities alike. The choice is clear: business as usual or real, lasting social change. It's time to demand better.